Welcome back to the channel. What you're about to hear today is going to completely change the way you think about private aviation safety. We're talking about the accident that has shaken not just the NASCAR world, but the entire aviation community over the past few weeks. The Cessna Citation crash that took the life of Greg Biffle, the famous NASCAR driver, along with two other people. But this isn't just another video about an aviation accident. This is about what happens when multiple small factors align in just the perfect way to create a tragedy, and about how an engine failure can trigger a chain of events that even the most experienced pilot couldn't have anticipated. Normally, I would wait for the preliminary report from the National Transportation Safety Board before doing a full analysis of any accident. That report usually comes out in a couple of weeks and contains verified information, concrete technical data, professional analysis. But in this case, something extraordinary has happened. Evidence has emerged that we simply cannot ignore. There's an audio recording circulating online that supposedly captured the final moments of this flight. And what that recording says is absolutely chilling. But before we get to that, I need you to understand exactly what kind of aircraft we're talking about and what could have gone so terribly wrong. The Cessna Citation II is a twin-engine executive jet that's been in service for decades. It's reliable, it's proven, it's a workhorse of corporate aviation. Thousands of these aircraft have flown millions of hours without incident. But like any complex machine, it has its quirks, it has its weaknesses, and one of those weaknesses is about to become the center of our story. I'm talking about the forward baggage compartment doors. Now, before you think I'm making a big deal about something as simple as a baggage door, let me tell you something that's going to surprise you. On older Citation models, these doors are not electronically monitored. Read that again. There's no sensor, there's no warning light in the cockpit, there's no alarm. There's absolutely nothing that tells the pilot if that door is properly secured or not. In the world of modern aviation, where we have sensors for practically everything from tire pressure to oil temperature, the fact that a door that can open in flight and cause catastrophic damage has no monitoring whatsoever is frankly insane. This is what aviation experts call poor human factors. It basically means that the system design depends completely on a human being doing everything perfectly every single time. There's no backup, there's no safety net. One single mistake, one single distraction, one single moment of forgetfulness, and you have a potentially deadly problem on your hands. And believe me when I tell you this isn't just theory. There are real precedents, documented cases of exactly this scenario playing out with devastating consequences. Just last year, in 2024, a Citation II departing from Ernesto Cortizos International Airport in Barranquilla, Colombia, experienced exactly this problem. The right-hand forward baggage compartment door opened shortly after takeoff. Items inside the compartment, suitcases, bags, equipment, were sucked out by the tremendous pressure differential and airflow. And here's the scary part. Some of those items were directly ingested into the number 2 engine, the right-hand engine. The engine's compressor blades were shredded. The engine suffered massive damage and complete failure. Fortunately, in that case, the crew was extremely experienced. They had sufficient altitude, they had sufficient airspeed, and most importantly, they had sufficient time to assess the situation, execute the appropriate emergency procedures, and return to the airport safely using only the number 1 engine. They landed without further incident. Everyone survived, but that positive outcome depended on them having those critical margins of time, altitude, and airspeed. Now let's go back a bit further in time to the year 2007. Another citation, another takeoff, another baggage door that wasn't properly secured. But this time, the story didn't have a happy ending. In this case, the door opened during the initial climb phase, right when the aircraft was in its most vulnerable configuration. The noise was deafening, wind roaring through the cabin at speeds exceeding 250 kilometers per hour, the visual disruption of items flying everywhere, absolute chaos at a moment when the pilots needed maximum concentration. The crew became distracted. They lost focus on the most important thing, flying the airplane. Airspeed began to decay. Angle of attack increased. And before they could recover, the aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall. At low altitude immediately after takeoff, there's no margin to recover from a stall. The Citation crashed. Everyone on board died. And all because a simple door wasn't secured properly and there was no system to warn the pilots about that fact. So why am I telling you these stories? Because when you look at the post-crash photos from Greg Biffle's flight, when you really study them closely, something jumps out immediately. The right-hand forward baggage compartment door is missing. It's not there. And when you look more closely at the right-hand engine, you can clearly see significant damage to the compressor fan blades. That specific combination, missing door and right-hand engine damage, is not a coincidence. It's a signature. It's exactly what we would expect to see if the same sequence of events that occurred in Barranquilla had happened here. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board has not officially confirmed whether the baggage door was found in the debris field, was found somewhere else along the flight path, or is simply missing entirely and hasn't been located yet. The only thing they've said publicly is that all four corners of the aircraft have been accounted for. And that's a very specific statement that I need you to understand correctly because it's important. When the NTSB says all four corners have been accounted for, what they're saying is that the main structure of the aircraft, the wings, the fuselage, the tail, the stabilizers, all of that has been located in the impact area. It didn't separate in flight. There was no catastrophic breakup of the fuselage in the air. There was no wing separation, no tail separation, no catastrophic loss of flight control surfaces. Essentially, they're ruling out the possibility that the aircraft disintegrated in the air due to structural forces or structural failures. But that doesn't mean every individual component of the aircraft has been found and cataloged. Early in an investigation, that level of detailed reconstruction simply isn't possible. There are thousands of pieces scattered across the accident site. It will take weeks, possibly months, to gather everything, identify each component, and reconstruct the exact sequence of events. So the fact that they haven't specifically mentioned the baggage door doesn't mean they've found it. It simply means they're not ready to make public statements about specific components yet. Now let's talk about the basic facts of what happened that day. It was the morning of the accident, approximately 10:05 Eastern Time. The citation departed runway 10 at Statesville Regional Airport, North Carolina. This is a relatively small airport located approximately 30 miles north of Charlotte. Weather conditions that day were what we call marginal VFR, visual flight rules, but barely. Cloud ceilings were around 1,200 feet, broken, not solid, but fairly overcast. Visibility was approximately 5 statute miles, reduced by light drizzle. Technically legal for VFR flight. Technically within minimums, but definitely not ideal conditions. The aircraft took off normally, or at least apparently normally, from runway 10. It began its initial climb, but then something went wrong. Something went very, very wrong. Approximately 10 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft impacted the ground approximately 1,800 feet short of the threshold of runway 28. They had attempted to return, they had turned around, they had tried to get back to the airport. But they didn't make it. The time from takeoff to impact was only approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes from an apparently normal takeoff to a tragedy that claimed 3 lives. The aircraft in question was November 257 Bravo Whiskey, a privately owned Cessna Citation II operating under Part 91 regulations. Now that's important, so let me explain what that means. Part 91 is the section of the Federal Aviation Regulations that governs general aviation operations, private flights, non-commercial operations. It's different from Part 1. 35, which covers air taxi and charter operations, and it's very different from Part 121, which covers major commercial airlines. Under Part 91, the regulations are considerably more flexible. There aren't the same strict recurrent training requirements. There aren't the same competency check requirements. There isn't the same regulatory oversight. And most importantly for our story, the requirements for who can serve as a second in command are much less stringent. But we'll get to that in a minute because it's absolutely critical to understanding what may have happened in that cockpit. The Cessna Citation II normally requires 2 pilots. It's certificated for 2 crew operations. However, there is a special exemption, a special approval that allows certain highly qualified pilots to fly the aircraft single pilot without a co-pilot. But that exemption requires additional specialized training, additional competency checks, additional experience. It's not something you just automatically get. You have to work for it. You have to demonstrate proficiency. And according to publicly available information, the pilot in command on this flight either was not qualified for that single pilot exemption or had been qualified very recently, meaning his experience operating the aircraft solo would have been minimal. Now, here's where the story gets really complicated and really important. There were 3 people on board this aircraft. All three were certificated pilots. All three held FAA-issued pilot licenses. But only one of them held a citation type rating. Only one of them was legally qualified to act as pilot in command of this specific aircraft. That person was Dennis Dutton, a 67-year-old man, former Delta Airlines captain with decades of experience flying transport category jets, a professional pilot in every sense of the word. According to public records and regulatory requirements, Dennis Dutton required a qualified second in command to operate this aircraft. He didn't have the single pilot exemption. He needed somebody else in the right seat. Now, under Part 91 regulations, that second in command doesn't necessarily need to have a citation type rating. That surprises a lot of people, but it's true. According to the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 14, Part 61, Section 55, Subsection B, a second in command in Part 91 operations can serve without a type rating as long as they meet certain familiarization requirements. Those requirements include things like a certain number of takeoffs and landings in the aircraft type, familiarization with the aircraft systems, familiarization with emergency procedures, that sort of thing. It's a much lower standard than what's required for a pilot in command, but it technically meets the regulations. And this is where we get into a really troubling gray area in aviation regulations, because technically legal and actually safe are not necessarily the same thing. Also on board was Dennis's son, Jack Dutton. Jack was a junior college student in Auburn University's professional flight program. He was a smart young man, enthusiastic, passionate about aviation, working to build a career as a professional pilot. According to FAA records, Jack held a private pilot certificate for single-engine aircraft. He had recently obtained his instrument rating, which is great. It's a significant accomplishment. But here's the critical problem. He did not have a multi-engine rating. He wasn't even qualified to fly basic piston twin-engine aircraft, let alone a sophisticated twin-engine jet like the Citation. The third person on board was Greg Biffle himself, the famous NASCAR driver. Biffle held a multi-engine rating. Technically, he could have served as second in command under Part 91 regulations if he had met those familiarization requirements I mentioned earlier. And given the significant financial investment required to obtain multiple pilot ratings, given the amount of time and money Biffle had clearly invested in his aviation career, it's reasonable to assume his intention was to eventually fly the Citation himself, with Dennis Dutton acting as the experienced pilot in command, likely also satisfying the aircraft's insurance policy requirements. Now, here's the absolutely critical detail that changes everything about this investigation. This aircraft had a cockpit voice recorder installed. Under Part 91 regulations, cockpit voice recorders are not required. You don't have to have one. But this particular aircraft had previously operated under Part 135 charter operations, where voice recorders are required. And when the aircraft was transferred to private Part 91 operations, the recorder was simply left installed. Nobody bothered to remove it. This means the National Transportation Safety Board has an audio recording of everything that happened in that cockpit. They have every word that was spoken. They have every alarm that sounded. They have every radio communication. They know exactly who was sitting in the left seat. They know exactly who was sitting in the right seat. They know exactly what was happening in those final moments. The rest of us will have to wait until the preliminary report is released to get that information, but the NTSB already knows. So who was flying the aircraft? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? My educated guess, based on standard operating practices, based on regulatory requirements, based on industry practices, is that Dennis Dutton was in the left seat, the traditional pilot in command seat, acting as the pilot in command. And normally we would expect Greg Biffle to be in the right seat, the co-pilot seat, gaining experience, building his time, working toward his eventual goal of flying the aircraft himself. But here's the complicating human factor that we can't ignore. Jack Dutton was Dennis's son. He was a young aviation student, passionate about flying, probably had dreamed for years about the opportunity to sit in the cockpit of a real jet, the opportunity for a father and son to sit side by side at the controls of a Cessna Citation. Well, that would be an incredibly special moment. The emotional pull to make that happen would have been extremely strong. And unfortunately, we cannot rule out the possibility that Jack, despite not having the required legal qualifications, was occupying the co-pilot seat. If that were the case, if Jack was actually in the right seat, despite not having a multi-engine rating, that would place the operation completely outside regulatory compliance. It would be a violation of federal aviation regulations. And more importantly, from a safety perspective, it would mean Dennis Dutton was essentially flying solo. Because a co pilot who has no experience in multi engine aircraft, who has never flown a jet before, who isn't familiar with the systems, that co pilot cannot provide any meaningful assistance in an emergency. So, in fact, they could be a distraction or even a hindrance in airline operations where we have years and years of safety data, where we've studied thousands of accidents and incidents. There's one statistic that comes up again and again. The pilot who is not flying, the pilot who is monitoring, is approximately 75% more likely to catch an error than the pilot who is flying. But that's only true if the monitoring pilot is adequately trained, adequately qualified, adequately experienced. An inexperienced co-pilot, a co-pilot who isn't familiar with the aircraft, a co-pilot who doesn't know what to look for, that pilot provides no safety margin whatsoever. And this is where we get to the audio that's been circulating online, the audio that's caused so much controversy, so much speculation. Several days after the crash, an audio recording of unknown origin appeared online. It supposedly captures radio transmissions from the accident flight. It supposedly records the voices of the pilots during the emergency. The clip gained significant legitimacy after Vase Aviation, a highly respected YouTube channel that specializes in aviation communications, published a video using the audio. Vase Aviation stated the audio had been sent to them by viewers, but they couldn't independently verify its origin. And there's the massive problem. There's no chain of custody for this audio. We don't know who recorded it. We don't know where it was recorded. We don't know when it was recorded. We don't know if it's been edited or altered in any way. In any serious investigation, that lack of provenance would be an immediate red flag. It would be cause for extreme skepticism. And yet the audio has spread widely. It's been amplified by multiple aviation channels. It's been discussed in forums and social media groups everywhere. And almost nobody has stopped to ask if it's actually authentic. Now, that being said, the audio does have some things going for it from a technical analysis perspective. Several audio analysts who have examined the recording have said that with high confidence, it originated from actual VHF aviation radio communications, not from a studio recreation. The specific technical characteristics of the audio, the noise floor, the static interaction, the bandwidth characteristics, all of it is consistent with direct radio capture. It's not consistent with somebody recording a speaker with an iPhone. There are no echoes, there are no spatial cues, there are no phase artifacts we would expect to see from an external recording. Normally, when aviation audio appears online, it comes from networks like Live ATC. These are community-based radio scanner networks that constantly monitor aviation frequencies and stream the audio live over the internet. They also archive the recordings for several days. And here's the thing, if this audio had been captured by any of those normal Live ATC networks, if it had been part of the normal archive, it would have gone viral almost instantly. Aviation enthusiasts monitor those channels constantly. Anything as dramatic as an emergency involving a famous NASCAR driver would have been noticed, downloaded, shared, and discussed within hours, if not minutes. The fact that this audio didn't surface until nearly a week after the crash, the fact that there was no social media discussion about it, the fact that nobody in the Live ATC community mentioned it, all of that raises serious questions about where it really came from. Major news outlets, mainstream media have largely ignored the audio entirely, probably due to those same provenance concerns. If this is a hoax, if somebody actually fabricated this audio, then it's an unusually sophisticated hoax. It would require specialized equipment. It would probably require an airborne transmitter and a ground-based receiver. It would require knowledge of the technical characteristics of VHF aviation radio communications. It would require audio editing skills. That's well beyond the level of effort of most internet pranksters. For that reason, I personally don't believe it's completely fabricated, but I'm also not entirely convinced it came from the accident flight. It could be from another flight. It could be from a different incident. We just don't know. The actual content of the audio transcript is also a bit strange if you really analyze it. There's repeated use of the word issue or problem, but the speaker never really specifies what the problem is. In genuine emergency calls, in real Mayday declarations, pilots usually state the specific nature of the failure. They say engine failure or hydraulic failure or cabin fire. They give specific information because they need controllers and other pilots in the area to know what kind of help they might need. That being said, if the problem was something potentially embarrassing, like an open baggage door, something that might make the pilot look careless or unprofessional, well, there might be some reluctance to broadcast that on a public frequency. So the vague language could make sense in that context. Another line in the audio that's unusual is something like, we're getting everything going, we're getting our gear down. That's not really language you would normally hear on CTF communications, which are airport traffic communications. Lowering the landing gear is a routine task. It's part of the normal approach checklist. It's not something you would normally broadcast on the radio unless you were having a specific problem with the landing gear. It's possible that what we're hearing is only one side of a two-way conversation. It's possible there was somebody at the airport, maybe FBO personnel, maybe another pilot, who was in direct contact with the citation, and what we're hearing is just the responses. That would explain some of the odd language. But without the full context, without the other half of the conversation, it's hard to be certain. Despite the fact that the word Mayday is never used in the audio, the tone is clearly one of emergency. And it's worth pointing out that even in very famous emergencies, that specific word isn't always used. When Captain Sully Sullenberger had to ditch US Airways Flight 1549 in the Hudson River in the famous Miracle on the Hudson, he never used the word Mayday in any of his radio communications. And nobody questioned that it was a real emergency. The NTSB has publicly confirmed they received a text message from one of the aircraft's occupants stating they were making an emergency landing. They confirmed that text exists. But what they notably haven't done, is acknowledge any audio from the pilots suggesting the same thing. That omission is really puzzling. It's strange. And frankly, it's suspicious. And this is where we get to the point I really want you to understand. Because some of you are probably thinking, well, so what you're telling me is that the audio I assumed was authentic actually was. What's the problem? But that question completely misses the point. We'll get to that in a moment. First, let me give you the most compelling reason to believe the audio is probably authentic. The technical evidence suggests the VHF communication was recorded directly from an actual VHF radio unit. And here's the critical detail. Toward the end of the transmission from the citation, the audio quality noticeably degrades. It becomes more choppy, more static-filled, harder to understand. And that's exactly what we would expect to see if the aircraft was losing line of sight with the receiving antenna due to extremely low altitude. As the plane descends lower and lower, as it gets closer and closer to the ground, terrain starts blocking the radio signal. Trees, buildings, hills, everything interferes with the transmission. That specific pattern of degradation is very difficult to fake. And then immediately after the citation transmission ends, there's another transmission, probably from somebody working at the airport FBO, informing other traffic in the area that the airport is now closed. And that audio is much higher quality, much clearer, exactly what we would expect from somebody transmitting from a fixed base radio at the airport itself. These kinds of technical details, these specific patterns, are really strong indications of authenticity. They're the kind of things that would be extremely difficult to replicate if you were trying to create fake audio. Now let's get to the real point, to the reason why all of this actually matters. In his second briefing with the press, NTSB board member and spokesperson Michael Graham was asked specifically about the audio. And what's really interesting, what's really revealing is how he responded. You'll notice that Graham starts to articulate what is objectively a false claim. He starts to say they didn't know if there was a problem with the aircraft, but then he corrects himself, realizes that's not sustainable, and makes an admission that there clearly was an emergency. When asked in the first briefing whether the crew had declared an emergency, Graham responded that they had no knowledge of an emergency declaration. Now, it's entirely possible that Graham personally had not listened to the cockpit voice recorder audio before that first briefing. Initial briefings often happen very quickly, and investigators haven't always had time to review all the evidence. But here's the thing, he almost certainly knew the recording existed because he mentioned audio recording several times during the briefing. If that audio clip circulating online is authentic, if it actually captured transmissions from the accident flight, then it clearly was an emergency declaration, albeit implied rather than explicit. So his statement that they had no knowledge of an emergency declaration clearly needed to be clarified, corrected, or contextualized. And indeed, Graham started the second day 2 briefing doing exactly that, clarifying that the emergency text from a family member actually did exist. But here's what's really strange. In that second day 2 briefing, Graham did not mention the word audio a single time, not once, not even when he made his standard appeal to the public to provide any additional information to the NTSB, video recordings, photographs, whatever. He didn't mention audio at all. It's hard to see this as anything other than deliberate evasion. It's hard to see this as anything but an intentional effort to avoid discussing the audio. And the reason the NTSB is being so careful here probably comes down to this. The voice on that audio recording sounds young. It sounds like the voice of a young man, not a 67-year-old man. And the NTSB clearly wants to keep that detail under wraps as long as possible. And here's the thing. They could have admitted the existence of the audio without revealing specific details. They could have simply said one of the pilots indicated the presence of an unspecified issue that prompted an immediate return to the airport. At this time, we don't have any more details than that. That would have been completely reasonable. It would have been transparent without compromising the investigation. But they didn't do that. They chose to avoid the subject entirely. They chose to evade. They chose not to answer. And frankly, it's hard to see that as anything but deliberate. In fact, the NTSB has completely ignored my direct inquiry about the authenticity of the audio clip that's being publicly distributed. Nobody expects complete transparency during an ongoing investigation. There are legitimate reasons to withhold certain information. But active evasion, lying by omission, that sows distrust, that makes it easier in the future for bad actors to muddy the conversation, that erodes public trust in the institution. And oddly, it also increases the credibility of small YouTube channels, of independent analysts who are less enamored with official bureaucratic confirmation than the major legacy media outlets. But that's a double-edged sword, and that's exactly the point here. Misinformation is a real thing. False information spreads quickly. And skepticism is absolutely appropriate when a striking detail materializes seemingly out of nowhere with no verifiable provenance. That audio recording is either a nearly perfect fraud, which seems seriously unlikely given the technical sophistication required, or the NTSB was deliberately evading the public during their second media briefing. And if it's the latter, that legitimately reduces confidence in the institution going forward. It creates an incentive for media outlets to be first to market with material of unverified origin because they can't trust officials to be straight with them. The voice on that recording sounds young. If that's accurate, if it actually came from the accident flight, it raises really uncomfortable implications about who was speaking into that microphone and whether the aircraft was being operated in accordance with federal aviation regulations. But here's the thing. Ultimately, it may not even matter who was occupying the right seat from a safety perspective. Under Part 91 regulations, second-in-command requirements are defined very loosely. A pilot can technically qualify, can meet the letter of the regulation, while lacking any meaningful competency, while lacking any real ability to contribute to flight safety. In airline operations, safety systems are layered. They're robust. They're filled with acronyms. There's LOSA, which is Line Operations Safety Audits. There's FOQA, which is Flight Operations Quality Assurance. There's ASEP, which is Aviation Safety Action Programs. There's mandatory recurrent training every 6 months. There are competency checks. There are data-driven feedback loops. There are multiple layers of safety net designed to catch problems before they become accidents. And one of the most enduring statistics, one of the most consistent findings from decades of safety research is that the pilot not flying is approximately 75% more likely to catch an error than the pilot who is flying. But that only works if they're adequately trained and experienced. An underqualified second pilot, a co-pilot who doesn't really know what they're doing, may provide no safety margin at all. In fact, they could be a liability. They could be a distraction at the exact moment when the pilot in command most needs to focus. Now let's move on to the actual flight data because this is where things get really murky and really difficult to interpret. Flight Radar 24, which is one of the major flight tracking services, shows only 24 ADS-B data points across the entire 10-minute flight. That's incredibly sparse. The first 23 data points cover only 2.5 minutes of flight. Then there's a complete void, a complete gap of 4 minutes where there's no data at all. And then there's one final data point approximately 30 seconds before impact. Trying to reconstruct what actually happened based on so few data points is incredibly difficult. ADSB Exchange, which is a different service that uses a different methodology, shows a much more erratic track and a much more complete track. They include unfiltered data that Flight Radar 24 automatically removes because it's considered unreliable. That unfiltered data depicts a climb from 1,800 feet to 4,000 feet at a vertical speed of nearly 4,000 feet per minute, followed by a chaotic descent. Some analysts, including Captain Steve, have speculated about possible flight control issues or even a physical struggle in the cockpit based on that erratic data. However, the more likely explanation, the more mundane explanation, is simply line of sight disruption between the aircraft and ground-based ADSB receiving stations over rolling terrain. North Carolina isn't completely flat. There are hills, there are valleys, there's rolling terrain. As the aircraft flies low over that kind of terrain, ADSB signals get intermittently blocked. This produces erroneous altitude readings, produces erroneous position data, produces all kinds of anomalies that don't reflect what the aircraft was actually doing. The most reliable information probably comes from the filtered Flight Radar 24 data, incomplete as it is, and that data shows the aircraft was already descending from approximately 2,000 feet. Airspeed had peaked near 187 knots and was then decreasing. Now, even with a complete failure of one engine, the combination of reduced airspeed and a controlled descent indicates the pilot had deliberately reduced thrust on both engines or on the remaining engine. They weren't at maximum power trying to climb. They were actively controlling airspeed and altitude. And if the baggage compartment door had opened, this would make perfect sense. The pilots would want to return to the airport immediately, obviously, but simultaneously they would want to keep airspeed relatively low to minimize additional damage to the door, to minimize the possibility of more items departing the compartment, to minimize airflow disruption around the fuselage. Some analysts have speculated, based on the limited flight track available, that it appears the aircraft was attempting to make a tight circle to land back on runway 10, the same runway they had departed from. That would also be reasonable given the limited data we have. However, after descending approximately 300 feet, something changed. The aircraft resumed climbing and accelerating simultaneously. It turned west of the airport. For approximately 20 seconds, it climbed 350 feet while accelerating 19 knots. That's a climb rate of approximately 1,000 feet per minute. Now, that matches the single-engine climb capability for a Citation II. It matches what would be possible with one engine running and one failed. But the simultaneous acceleration, the fact that airspeed was increasing at the same time, raises the possibility that both engines may still have been producing thrust at that point. If they only had one engine, we would expect to see either a climb or an acceleration, not necessarily both simultaneously. Post-crash imagery released by the NTSB shows significant foreign object damage to the right-hand engine compressor fan blades. When that engine is completely disassembled at a forensic analysis facility, when metallurgists examine the damaged blades under microscopes, investigators will be able to determine whether that damage resulted from tree strikes during the final crash, or whether it resulted from baggage. Ingestion following a possible opening of the nose baggage compartment door. Those are very different damage signatures, and experts can tell them apart. Regardless of when or how the engine damage occurred, the aircraft's initial climb after takeoff appears to be consistent with both engines operating normally. The climb was normal. The flight path was normal. There's nothing in the available data suggesting a problem immediately after takeoff. If the baggage compartment door wasn't properly secured, it would likely have opened when the nose pitched up during initial rotation. As the aircraft accelerates down the runway, as the pilot pulls back on the yoke and the nose starts to rise, that creates a massive low-pressure area over the forward fuselage. If the door wasn't fully latched, that pressure differential would blow it open. Depending on how the baggage compartment was loaded, depending on how items were arranged, depending on whether they were tied down, there could have been a delay before any item actually departed the compartment. It might have taken several seconds, maybe even a minute or more, before something was sucked out and ingested by the right-hand engine. Or the entire scenario may not have occurred at all. It may be that the baggage door is completely irrelevant, that it was torn off during impact, and the engine damage also came from impact. These questions should be definitively resolved when the preliminary report is published. Weather conditions that day were technically VMC, visual meteorological conditions, but barely. low ceilings around 1,200 feet, drizzle reducing visibility, visibility of only 5 miles, technically legal, technically within VFR minimums, but any experienced pilot will tell you those are marginal conditions. Those are conditions that require extra caution, extra situational awareness, extra safety margins. The crew was not in contact with air traffic control according to all available information. That strongly suggests they were not operating under instrument flight rules. If they had filed an IFR flight plan, if they had been in contact with ATC, controllers would have provided them radar vectors. They would have provided altitude protection, making sure they didn't fly into terrain. They would have provided an instrument approach back to the airport. They would have had all that safety support infrastructure available to them. Instead, the flight path, as we understand it, suggests a possible attempt to remain below the cloud layer, what pilots call scud running, flying underneath a low cloud layer in marginal visibility conditions. This is a known and documented risk factor in Part 91 accidents. It's legal under certain conditions, but it's inherently riskier than flying IFR with ATC support. The initial climb and turn after takeoff appear completely normal based on available data. At 2,000 feet, altitude stabilizes and airspeed begins to decay, indicating thrust reduction. The aircraft then descends and slows for approximately 90 seconds. It stabilizes briefly near 1,500 feet. It continues southwest. Then it resumes a climb and acceleration. And after that, the data deteriorates so badly, we really can't trust it. Either the aircraft executed a dramatic climb to 4,000 feet, which seems extremely unlikely given the circumstances, or ADS-B reception was lost due to terrain masking, which is what I strongly suspect. The final data point, the last ping before it all ended, places the aircraft low and abeam the airport on what appears to be a base leg for runway 28. They were positioning for landing. They were trying to get back. And then seconds later, they impacted the ground approximately 1,800 feet short of the runway. At the end of the day, this accident probably doesn't hinge on a single dramatic, catastrophic failure. It's not like a wing fell off or the plane exploded in the air. Instead, it hinges on margins. It hinges on how thin those safety margins can become when several small factors all line up at once in the wrong way. A baggage compartment door that may or may not have been properly secured, a single pilot exemption that may or may not have applied to this particular pilot, a second pilot seat occupied by someone who may or may not have been legally or practically capable of providing meaningful assistance, weather conditions that were technically legal for VFR flight but that were unforgiving, that provided no margin for error, a twin-engine jet climbing away from the ground with very little time available, very little altitude available, very little room for error available. None of those factors individually would be enough to bring down a Cessna Citation II. These are reliable aircraft. They have an excellent safety record, but aviation accidents rarely happen one failure at a time. Instead, they happen when normal operations quietly drift toward the edge of the safety envelope, when small deviations from standard procedure accumulate, when multiple small deficiencies all line up at once, and then something unexpected happens, something that requires the crew or the aircraft to perform at the top of their capability, and they discover the margins just aren't there. The audio that has emerged online may eventually prove completely authentic. It may be independently verified and accepted as part of the official record, or it may fade away as an artifact with no verifiable origin, dismissed as unreliable. The ADS-B data may turn out to be noisy, filtered, incomplete, misleading, not reliable enough to draw firm conclusions. The baggage compartment door may end up being completely irrelevant to the accident sequence. But the cockpit voice recorder won't be ambiguous. The NTSB already knows exactly who was flying this aircraft. They know exactly which pilot was sitting in the left seat. They know exactly which pilot was sitting in the right seat. They know exactly when the tone in that cockpit changed from routine to urgent. They know exactly which alarms sounded. They know exactly which checklists were run or not run. They know exactly what was said in those final moments. And when the preliminary report is finally published, probably in the next couple of weeks, it will either close some doors definitively, or it will open other doors that many people aren't expecting, doors that lead to uncomfortable questions about regulatory compliance, about operational decisions, about human factors. Until then, until we have that official report, the most important lesson here isn't about baggage doors. It's not about ADS-B data points. It's not about audio files of questionable provenance. It's about discipline. It's about structure. It's about understanding that regulations alone don't create safety. Training creates safety. Margins create safety. Competency creates safety. Standardized procedures create safety because when the weather is marginal, when the workload is high, when something goes wrong right after takeoff, when you're low and slow and heavy with fuel, there's no room for ambiguity. There's no room for casual compliance with regulations. There's no room for taking shortcuts. And there's definitely no room for an untrained voice in a seat that really matters. Aviation is absolutely unforgiving of uncertainty. It's unforgiving of lack of preparation. It's unforgiving of half measures. And sometimes, as we saw in this tragic case, it only takes 10 minutes to prove it. Only 10 minutes from takeoff to 3 lives lost. That's all for today's video. If you found this analysis useful, if you learned something, give it a like, share it, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think. See you in the next one.